Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson we're going to be discussing the 18th to the 30th verses of Luke's 18th chapter. We've already read this story twice before in the 19th chapter of Matthew and the 10th chapter of Mark. It is the story of the rich young ruler asking significant questions pertaining to salvation, and there's a lot of where the conversation leads is actually thrilling, but for now I just want to establish that we do read details in Luke's as well as in Matthew's and Mark's that are not there in any other, so this is one of the advantages of having more depth perception from more eyewitnesses. Now, Matthew himself, in all likelihood, may have physically witnessed the instruction in the parable. Mark, unlike Luke, the evidence is that Mark was a pre-resurrection convert, whereas there's no mention of Luke in the Gospels. He does receive mention in some of the Pauline epistles, and he does when you start to read the word "we" in Acts 16:10. That's when he's involved in that. But more to the point, there are Matthew and Mark's follow the same narrative trajectory. The 19th and the 10th chapter both open with a question and controversy stirred up by the Pharisees with nefarious intent, trying to make the master look stupid with a question over a bizarrely arranged question over the nature of divorce, which exposes their own utter abject ignorance as to the rationale and intent and the significance and the meaning of that law. So he does not mince words with his answers. He tells them flat out, "It is for the hardness of your hearts that Moses wrote this commandment." And then we receive also they are all preceded by a blessing of children. We read the tender affection and regard he had for children. But what comes before Luke's chapter is a little different. We read of two parables, and we'll cover them briefly, and then the children. And Matthew's account bleeds into the parable. His closing line is, "The first shall be last, and the last shall be first." Then the 20th chapter bleeds into opens with the parable elucidating upon this teaching, which is connected to the same lesson, but marked into a distinct chapter for whatever reason. And the parable of the vineyard owner who he hires workers throughout every hour of the day, and at the end of the day pays them all the same wages, and that's likened to the first being last, the paradox of salvation. And in Mark and Luke's account, the story is succeeded by a prediction of his death given in the company of the disciples who do not intuit the significance or take it seriously, strangely enough. But Mark's 10th chapter also ends with the healing of blind Bartimaeus, of what we can read in that. We want to focus on Luke now. So the two parables, the first of the one, parable first off is instructive illustration, which uses relatable narrative imagery and scenery, familiar human experiences in story forms to illuminate didactic truths or impart moral lessons. And the first one of which we read consists of a judge and a widow. Now this judge is not a righteous man. He neither fears Elohim nor nor regards his man. And the widow, being vulnerable, we can imagine she may have had a number of legitimate grievances to address with this man, and she knocks so persistently all day, every day on his door, and then finally the judge relents. He gives in to her persistency and accommodates her request, and then it's applied to the Messiah. In the 7th verse, "And shall Elohim not do right by all means to his own chosen ones, who are crying out day and night to him, and being patient over them?" So the lesson we extract from that is that the prayer is not a one-time event. It is a perpetual practice to bring us closer, and sometimes we have to repeat our prayers, and there's nothing unrighteous about asking for the same thing twice, and there's going to be one of three answers: yes, no, or not yet. So we can keep praying for the not yet. So once we've been given a clear sign that no means no, that's when we got to stop praying for those, when we receive that revelation. Then the second parable consist of a character contrast. The Pharisees and the tax collectors. In society, the Pharisees were regarded as righteous, and the tax collectors were the reviled amongst the reviled. They were a unique category of sinner, so much so that in places such as Luke 15:1 or 2, we read that they're categorized, the sinners and publicans. And so, but he reverses the order in the kingdom. Those who are exalted on earth will be debased in heaven, and he reveals that through the content of their respective prayers. And the Pharisee, when he prays, he doesn't really pray at all. He just exalts himself essentially at the expense of everyone in the room. He lists what he does. He tithes of all he has. He fasts twice a week. I think Mondays and Thursdays were the days that the Pharisees customarily fasted. So he was a Pharisee, and but then we read of the publican, who has a different approach and a different attitude. He has a sense of his own worthlessness and his own spiritual bankruptcy and his own needs. So he smites his breast, because at the heart of every problem is the problem of the heart. He recognized the location of his dilemma and says, Father, have mercy on me, a sinner. And the Messiah says that this man went down justified. And then he ties it into the paradoxical precept that everyone who is exalting himself shall be humbled, and he who is humbling himself shall be exalted, of which we also read in the different context in the 14th chapter and 11th verse. Then he's confronted by or surrounded or approached by infants. So we gather young children, and the disciples try to prevent them from reaching him, but he rebukes them and gives them permission and tells them, whoever does not receive the kingdom of Elohim as a little child shall certainly not enter into it. So childlikeness, not childish, there is a distinction with a difference, and it's an important one, is a necessary prerequisite for salvation. But we don't want to waste time elaborating on the distinction and the difference. We want to focus on the passage itself. We think that's a long enough preamble. Opening verse, and a certain ruler asked him, saying, Good teacher, what shall I do to inherit everlasting life? So in Matthew's account, we read that he was a young man. In Mark's account, we read he was simply a man. Luke identifies him as a ruler, so he might have been an officer in a synagogue or a rabbi, and he approaches. Now, it was customary for rabbis to be greeted as teachers, but to call any human good was a technical violation of the mores of the time. Elohim alone was good. Goodness is uniquely and intrinsically his, so much so that we can, and any goodness we have emanates from him and his goodness to us. But so, he has, maybe he's somewhat of a suck-up, this rich young ruler, but he does have good manners, and the motivation and the intent, there is no inference of any ulterior motive behind the question, and unlike for example, the lawyer who interrogates the Messiah in the famous Good Samaritan parable, Luke 10:25, we read of him. He asked with a different motive. It was to trap him, but there being no inference of any ulterior motive, we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. He was sincere in his question, and even the same question asked with the wrong intent is worthy of all consideration. What must I do to inherit eternal life? That's what we're all here for, I hope. That is the greatest gift and treasure. And there's nothing we can do, and salvation is not inherited, just to give us, to answer those questions in advance. So Yahshua said to him, Why do you call me good? No one is good except one, Elohim. So as I already explained, according to Jewish custom, goodness was a title uniquely reserved for Elohim, or Yahweh the Father. And so he's not denying his claim to be divinity. He just wants this man to have an awareness of who he's speaking to, and if he's rather being polite. So we gather that this man was sincere but superficial. He had good manners, and he had confidence in his legalism, but he asked the right question but received an answer he was unwilling to apply, and he departed sad. Just that's getting a little far ahead of ourselves. You know the commands: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness, respect your father and your mother. So he gives him essentially the same answer as in Luke 10:26 that he does to the lawyer with nefarious intent. He says, salvation rests on the law and the prophets. How dost thou read it? So he reads it here. The commandments, these are the 5 of the 6 moral commandments. Each of one has its own reason and rationale. Thou shalt not commit adultery. That's self-evident, as is murder, stealing, and bearing false witness. And then he opens, and the reverse order opens with the opening command of the Decalogue, but the one that he hasn't mentioned from the our righteous section, the final 6, is the 10th and final one, which is different in that it's not an action, it's an attitude, and it exposes the chink in his spiritual armor. His riches were his idol. An idol is anything that is a substitute for Yahweh as the supreme source of satisfaction. And he said, all these I have watched over from my youth. So this man not only had impeccable manners, but impeccable morals, at least from a legalistic vent. He was in the steady and consistent practice of observable obedience to the requirements of the law, and had been so since my youth. So youth, I think the Jewish, he's a young man, remember. So youth would have been, I think the bar and bat mitzvahs are alike, celebrated at the age of 13 years old. So he had the superficial satisfaction, but he knew something was missing. He knew there was a missing added ingredient, and that's what motivated and prompted the question. He knew there was something missing. He was doing all the right things, but he wasn't sure if he was doing everything he could do to inherit eternal life. And hearing this, Yahshua said to him, yet one you lack. Sell all that you have and distribute to the poor, and you shall have treasure in the heavens, and come follow me. So in Matthew's account, he asks, what lack I yet? Here, the term lack is in the answer. And the commandment that he's telling him to do is not a universal commandment. It was specific to this individual. He wanted him to sell his riches and become homeless to follow this vagabond itinerant preacher who is technically homeless and relying on the charity of others. This man had a comfortable home, at least one we can imagine, and a comfortable life. He was a rich young ruler, remember, so he would have had to take all his goods, of which he had many, we eventually read, and give them to the poor, because right now those were the things which were hindering the answer to his question of eternal exaltation. He was following the law, but he summons him the same that he summoned all his eventual apostles with the same words of summon, follow me. That is known as the call of the Savior, and we've all heard it. All authentic disciples have heard it and responded accordingly at least once in our life. But when he heard this, he became intensely sad, for he was extremely rich. So he asked the right question, got the right answer, but what departed intensely sad. So that detail is descriptive. It was more than an ordinary amount of sadness, we gather, and it was because he was extremely rich. So he was inordinately wealthy. He may have been, the equivalent of a 100 millionaire in our world. Because that is, someone I consider extremely rich in our. So he had a lot to sell. He was not asking him to. This would have been easier to the disciples who forsook the fish nets, and slightly more tempting to Matthew, who forsook the publican's collection bucket. But it was. This was an extreme request, and he was extremely rich, so that explains his intense tragic sense of tragedy at the answer he received and asked for. And he received the right answer, but he made the wrong move, because we read that he left eventually. And when Joshua saw that he became increasingly sad, he said, "How hard is it for those who have riches to enter into the reign of Elohim?" So what's interesting here, and this I notice, is that he speaks this words to him. In at least Mark's account, I believe he speaks it to the apostles after this man departs with the same spirit of sadness. But here he tells the young man itself how hard it is for those who have riches to enter into the kingdom of heaven. Riches are not an automatic and unconditional barrier to the exalted abode. Many men, wealthy men, have been wealthy without being morally corrupted by it. It is possible to own possessions without them possessing you. So it's not an impossible balancing act, but it is difficult because rich people are exposed to temptations that are a lot more challenging to poor people, many of whom would long to have even the option to choose the idol of comfort and satisfaction in wealth and earthly treasure and standing. So it is, it can be a curse and a blessing that you were born rich, as far as your reception and response of the message. But it can be done. For it is easier for a camel to enter through a needle's eye than for a rich man to enter into the reign of Elohim. So the scale of comparison is the largest beast recognized in ancient Israel with the smallest thing, the needles of the eye. So that is that he compares the challenge, and that is an absurdly extremely one, at least from the vantage point from which he explains it. For a rich man who is in love with his wealth and trusts it and sacrifices for it and has faith in it above everything else, it is easier for that camel, the largest of all beasts, to physically pass through the smallest of all windows. And those who heard it said, "And who is able to be saved?" So this is a response from the audience. This might have been the disciples who were with him more or less on all occasions. They traveled intimately with him and said, who is able to be saved? This is a legitimate question in response to the difficulty and challenges that are at least present for those who are rich. Who can be saved if the rich have such challenges? And remember, from their Jewish vantage point, riches were considered a blessing from Yahweh. But he answers that question. What is impossible with men is possible with Elohim. So he said that's not the first time we've heard this. Mark also, his version records something similar, but Luke refers to something in a different context. In 137, the Ruach Kodesh informs the Virgin Mary that her impregnation, her supernatural impregnation, is possible for the one who's going to bring it about. And the same miraculous whirlwind of miracles who can combine divinity within the human framework, the incarnation and the virgin birth, are miracles beyond description. There's no way we can fully understand it, at least not this side of the resurrection. But it's the impossibility. A lot of religions more militantly monotheistic than us, Islam in particular, struggles with the concept of their deity who is so utterly transcendent as to lack the balancing character of immanence. But what here, in this specific context, the one of which we're reading of and supposed to be concentrating our attention on, we do wander and go on tangents. That's just the way it works. Is that as difficult as it is from a human vantage point to have riches and to gain access into the blessed abode of heaven, it is possible with Elohim. So apart from Elohim working in and through that rich person's life, he's not going to be permanently united with him in eternity in heaven. And Peter said, See, we have left all and followed you. And he said to them, Truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or parents or brothers or wife or children for the sake of the kingdom of Elohim, who shall not receive many times more in this present time than in the age to come everlasting life. So that's a single sentence, or it's the final two verses are a response to the question. So Peter states a fact, this is irrefutable, that they had forsaken, he and his brother Andrew had forsaken their fish nets, as had John and Zebedee. Simon the Zealot forsook his zealot pre-life. Matthew abandoned the tax collector post. They all had professional obligations that they dropped out of the way to follow him, literally follow him, live with him as homeless, relying on the charity of man as much as he is to feed and clothe and house themselves. And he assures them that the investment is well worth the reward for those. And he commands, and what's interesting here is this the family members he mentions. Now Luke has a lot of interesting things to say about the family and the concept of it. In the third chapter, he records the Messiah as saying there's this unnatural adulation for Mary that existed prior to the Catholic Church, which worships her and prays to her and idolizes her and everything else that is inappropriate to do in reference to her. But where was I going with that thought? Oh, yeah, he says, blessed are, they say, oh, blessed be the mother who sucked you. And he says, no, blessed are you if you hear the word of Elohim and obey it. And he likens his family as more important throughout the Gospels, his spiritual family as more important than the biological bloodline family. And his brothers did struggle to believe in his existence. But more in reference to Luke, where I was going with originally, in Luke 14:26, he commands that we must hate our mother and father and brother and sister in comparison to us. So overwhelmingly and abundant must the love that we have for him be that what love we have for those who hate us. He's not literally calling us to hate, but it will seem like hate in the comparison. And once more, the present time is this evil and wicked and perverse and fallen generation, but if we make it through this and endure and overcome, we have the assurance of everlasting life. That's the reason I'm here. I hope it's the reason you're here too, but that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.